the world knew him by two words: El Chapo. He escaped from two of Mexico's most secure federal prisons. He built tunnels stretching the length of football fields beneath maximum security walls. He commanded a criminal organization that the United States Drug Enforcement Administration would later describe as the most powerful drug trafficking operation in the world. Governments fell under his shadow. Law enforcement agencies across 3 continents spent decades hunting him. And when El Chapo was finally captured, for the third and final time, authorities made a decision that would be debated by criminologists, legal scholars, and security experts for years to come. They sent him here, a place buried in the southern Colorado Rockies, an elevation of over 5,000 feet, surrounded by nothing but wilderness and razor wire, a facility so restrictive, so deliberately isolating, that former inmates have described it as a place where time itself stops moving. This is ADX Florence. And this is the story of how El Chapo, one of the most wanted men in modern history, ended up sealed inside its walls, and why the world's most fortified prison was considered the only place on earth capable of holding him. If you're new here, you're watching Behind the Wall Stories, the channel that goes inside the world's most secure and secretive prisons, built on verified facts and documented history. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because this story is only just beginning. His real name was Joaquín Guzmán Loera, but the world would come to know him by the nickname that followed him from the mountains of Sinaloa to the front pages of every major newspaper on earth: El Chapo. A simple piece of Mexican slang meaning short or stocky, a reference to his modest physical stature, a man whose height rarely exceeded 5 feet 6 inches, yet whose reach at the peak of his power extended across continents. El Chapo was born on April 4th, 1957, in La Tuna, a small, impoverished village nestled in the mountains of Badiraguato, Sinaloa, in northwestern Mexico. It was a region long defined by geographic isolation and deep poverty, a landscape where, for generations, the cultivation of opium poppies had quietly become one of the few reliable sources of income for rural families struggling to survive. According to court records filed during his 2019 federal trial in the Eastern District of New York, Guzmán grew up in conditions of significant economic hardship. His father, Emilio Guzmán Bustillos, was reportedly involved in the local drug trade, a common reality in the Sierra Madre Occidental mountain communities of Sinaloa during that era. El Chapo's early life offered few conventional paths forward, and by his teenage years, he had reportedly entered the orbit of local figures connected to what would eventually become one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere, the Sinaloa Cartel. He did not found the Sinaloa Cartel alone. According to testimony presented at his trial and documented by the United States Department of Justice, El Chapo rose through the ranks under Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, one of the architects of Mexico's modern drug trade. Following Félix Gallardo's arrest in 1989, the fragmentation of that earlier structure created conditions under which Guzmán, alongside co-founder Ismael Mayo Zambada, would build the Sinaloa organization into a transcontinental operation. By the early 1990s, El Chapo had already attracted serious law enforcement attention across both sides of the border. Mexican federal authorities arrested him for the first time in 1993, following one of the most high-profile criminal events in modern Mexican history, a shooting at Guadalajara's International Airport that resulted in the death of Roman Catholic Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo. Though El Chapo denied responsibility for the cardinal's death, and the circumstances of that event remain the subject of ongoing historical and legal debate, the arrest marked his first major confrontation with federal justice. He was sentenced to 20 years in the Almoloya de Juarez Federal Penitentiary, later transferred to Puente Grande in Jalisco, then considered one of Mexico's most secure facilities. El Chapo walked out of Puente Grande in January 2001, reportedly concealed in a laundry cart, according to accounts documented by Mexican prosecutors and later reported by journalists, including Joan Grillo, whose research on the Mexican drug trade is considered among the most credible in English-language journalism. That escape from a maximum security federal prison transformed El Chapo from a regional cartel figure into a global symbol of institutional vulnerability. It was the beginning of a decade-long flight that would span 3 continents of law enforcement attention and culminate, ultimately, in the fortified silence of a cell in Florence, Colorado. The path from those Sinaloa mountains to the most secure prison on American soil was not a straight line. It was a journey measured in court filings, extradition treaties, diplomatic negotiations, and 2 more arrests. It was a story that would take over 3 decades to fully resolve, and one whose final chapter is still, in certain legal respects, being written. But the physical endpoint is not in question. Cell number 17, ADX Florence, a 6-by-9-foot concrete room with no view of the outside world. El Chapo, the man who once commanded an empire, now reduced to a space smaller than most people's bathroom. The nickname the world had whispered with a mixture of fear and disbelief now belonged not to a fugitive, but to an inmate, permanently, irrevocably, alone. When El Chapo walked out of Puente Grande federal prison in January 2001, he did not simply disappear. He rebuilt, and what he built over the following 13 years will become one of the most sophisticated criminal infrastructure networks ever documented by American and Mexican law enforcement combined. The first decade following his escape from Puente Grande represented the most expansive period of the Sinaloa cartel's operational growth. According to evidence presented at El Chapo's 2019 trial in the Eastern District of New York, a proceeding that generated thousands of pages of verified testimony and documentary evidence. The organization during this period was responsible for smuggling hundreds of tons of cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and marijuana into the United States through an extraordinary range of methods. Documented methods included purpose-built underground tunnels crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, modified freight vehicles, commercial cargo shipments, and sophisticated logistical networks embedded within legitimate trade infrastructure. The tunnels, in particular, became something of a signature. According to reports published by the United States Drug Enforcement Administration and later confirmed in federal court proceedings, the Sinaloa cartel under El Chapo's direction constructed or utilized dozens of cross-border tunnels during this period, some stretching hundreds of meters, equipped with ventilation systems, electric lighting, and rail tracks for moving cargo efficiently. These were not crude excavations. They were engineered structures, reflecting both significant financial investment and considerable logistical planning. Throughout this period, El Chapo remained a fugitive. The Mexican government, under pressure from United States law enforcement agencies, including the DEA and FBI, maintained an active pursuit. His name appeared on the DEA's most wanted list. Interpol maintained a standing international notice. Yet for over a decade, he remained beyond reach, moving between safe houses across Sinaloa and other Mexican states, reportedly relying on a combination of community loyalty, geographic knowledge of the Sierra Madre Mountains, and an extensive network of local informants who could monitor and report law enforcement movements. His second capture came on February 22, 2014, in the coastal city of Mazatlan, Sinaloa. Mexican Marines, operating on intelligence coordinated with United States federal agencies, located El Chapo in a condominium unit at the Miramar Resort Development. According to official accounts published by the Mexican Attorney General's office and widely reported by credible international news organizations, he was taken without significant resistance. It was a moment that generated international headlines, and briefly, a sense among law enforcement that a decades-long pursuit had finally reached its conclusion. That conclusion proved premature. On July 11, 2015, El Chapo escaped from the Altiplano Federal Penitentiary, formerly known as Centro Federal de Readaptación Social No. 1, through a tunnel that entered his cell through the floor of his shower. According to the subsequent Mexican government investigation and court documents filed in relation to the escape, the tunnel extended approximately 1.5 kilometers from the prison perimeter to a construction site outside the facility. It was equipped with modified motorcycle on rails, ventilation pipes, and electric lighting, representing months of coordinated construction work carried out without detection by prison authorities. The escape prompted a formal inquiry by the Mexican government and significant international criticism of the security standards at Altiplano. The second escape transformed the political and diplomatic calculus around El Chapo entirely. It was no longer a question of whether Mexico could prosecute him. The documented evidence of 2 successful escapes from maximum security federal facilities made the answer to that question, in the eyes of United States law enforcement and the Mexican federal government, uncomfortably clear. An extradition process, long discussed but politically complex, now moved with renewed urgency. His third and final capture occurred on January 8, 2016, in Los Mochis, Sinaloa. Mexican Marines, again operating on coordinated intelligence, located El Chapo in a house in the city's residential districts following a confrontation that resulted in the deaths of 5 individuals and the injury of 1 Marine. According to official Mexican government records, El Chapo was taken into custody and, critically, this time held under conditions specifically designed to prevent any further escape, pending a formal extradition process that would ultimately deliver him to United States jurisdiction. On January 19, 2017, the eve of a presidential inauguration in the United States, El Chapo was extradited from Mexico to New York. He arrived at Long Island MacArthur Airport and was transferred immediately to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where he would be held throughout the duration of his trial. The man who had spent 15 years as one of the world's most hunted fugitives was now in American custody, and this time there would be no laundry cart, no tunnel beneath the shower floor, no mountains to disappear into. This time, the destination was already decided. ADX Florence was waiting. On November 13, 2018, in a federal courtroom in the Eastern District of New York, one of the most consequential criminal trials in modern American legal history began. The defendant was Joaquín Guzmán Loera, El Chapo. The charges were sweeping, the evidence extraordinary, and the witness list unlike anything a United States federal court had assembled in living memory. The indictment against El Chapo contained 17 counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, international cocaine distribution conspiracy, use of firearms, and money laundering. According to the Department of Justice's official case documentation, prosecutors alleged that between 1989 and 2014, El Chapo and his co-conspirators had been responsible for importing more than 200 tons of cocaine into the United States alone, alongside significant quantities of heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana. The financial scale of the operation alleged by prosecutors was staggering. Estimates cited in court proceedings placed the total revenue generated by the Sinaloa cartel during this period in the billions of dollars. The trial lasted approximately 3 months. It was presided over by United States District Judge Brian Cogan, and the jury, whose identities were kept confidential throughout proceedings for security reasons, an unusual but legally justified measure, heard testimony from more than 50 witnesses over the course of the trial. Security arrangements around the courthouse in Brooklyn were among the most extensive seen in the Eastern District's history, reflecting both the profile of the defendant and credible concerns about witness and juror safety documented in pretrial filings. What made the trial genuinely remarkable and what generated sustained international media attention throughout its duration was not merely the scale of the charges, but the nature of the testimony. Cooperating witnesses included former senior figures within the Sinaloa cartel itself, men who had operated alongside El Chapo for years, who had personal knowledge of the organization's structure, finances, methods, and decision-making processes, now sat in a Brooklyn federal courtroom and described those operations in precise and documented detail. Among the most significant cooperative witnesses was Jesus Reynaldo Zambada Garcia, known as El Rey, the brother of El Chapo's co-founder Ismael Mayo Zambada. According to trial transcripts published and widely reported by credible news organizations, including the New York Times, El Rey testified about internal cartel operations, bribery payments made to Mexican officials, and mechanics of cross-border drug shipments. His testimony, alongside that of other cooperating witnesses, provided the prosecution with a granular, internally corroborated account of the Sinaloa cartel's operations that proved extraordinarily difficult for the defense to challenge structurally. Another cooperating witness, Alejandro Etta, not to be confused with the actor who portrayed El Chapo in the Netflix series, testified about logistics and transportation networks. Additional witnesses described specific shipments, specific routes, and specific financial transactions, each account cross-referenced against physical evidence, including seized communications, financial records, and forensic documentation of tunnel construction along the U.S.-Mexico border. The defense, led by attorney Eduardo Ballarizo and later Jeffrey Lichtman, pursued a strategy that centered significantly on challenging the credibility of cooperating witnesses, many of whom had themselves committed serious crimes and were testifying in exchange for reduced sentences or other legal considerations. Lichtman, in his opening statement, argued that the true leader of the Sinaloa cartel was not El Chapo, but his co-founder Ismael Mayo Zambada, a claim that, while legally strategic, did not find sufficient traction with the jury to affect the verdict. El Chapo himself did not testify in his own defense, a constitutional right exercised by defendants in United States federal proceedings. He was present throughout the trial, observing through court-provided Spanish-language interpretation services. On February 12, 2019, after deliberating for approximately 6 days, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all 17 counts. There was no partial acquittal, no hung jury on individual charges. The verdict was complete and unambiguous. In the courtroom, El Chapo reportedly showed little visible reaction, according to pool reporters present at the proceedings. Sentencing was scheduled for July 17, 2019. When that day arrived, Judge Kogan sentenced Joaquín Guzmán Loera to life in prison plus 30 years, with no possibility of parole, and ordered the forfeiture of approximately $12.6 billion, a figure representing the estimated proceeds of his criminal enterprise as established by the evidence presented at trial. Judge Kogan, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the case. He noted the suffering caused by the volume of narcotics the Sinaloa cartel had introduced into communities across the United States and beyond, while maintaining the judicial tone appropriate to federal sentencing proceedings. His words were measured, formal, and final. For El Chapo, the courtroom in Brooklyn represented something genuinely unprecedented in his experience. Every previous encounter with the justice system, the 1993 arrest, the Puente Grande imprisonment, the Altiplano confinement, had ended with escape or release. The walls had never held permanently. These walls were different, and what waited beyond them was different still. The sentence was clear. The destination had already been selected long before the verdict was read. A cell in Colorado, 6 feet by 9, concrete, silence, and the rest of his natural life. There is a place in the United States federal prison system that operates by a completely different set of rules. A place designed not merely to confine, but to eliminate, entirely and permanently, any possibility of escape, communication, or continued criminal influence from within its walls. A place that even seasoned criminologists and legal scholars have described as representing the absolute outer limit of what a democratic society permits in terms of human confinement. Its formal name is the Administrative Maximum Facility, United States Penitentiary Florence. The world knows it simply as ADX Florence. And on July 19, 2019, 2 days after his sentencing in Brooklyn, Joaquín Guzmán Loera, El Chapo, passed through its outer gates for the first time. He has not left since. ADX Florence was constructed in the early 1990s and opened in November 1994, according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons' official institutional records. It was built in direct response to a series of high-profile incidents at other federal maximum security facilities, including the murders of correctional officers at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, which had itself replaced Alcatraz as the nation's most restrictive federal prison following that institution's closure in 1963. ADX Florence was conceived and designed to be the last resort of the American federal prison system, a facility where inmates who had demonstrated that conventional maximum security confinement was insufficient could be held under conditions that made escape violence or continued criminal coordination effectively impossible. The facility sits at an elevation of approximately 5,300 feet in the Fremont County region of southern Colorado, surrounded by the Rocky Mountain landscape and separated from a nearest significant urban center by miles of high-altitude terrain. It houses, at any given time, approximately 400 to 500 inmates, a deliberately small population for a facility of its security classification, reflecting the intensive individual monitoring each inmate requires. According to Federal Bureau of Prisons documentation, ADX Florence houses individuals who have been identified as requiring the most restrictive level confinement available within the federal system, including individuals convicted of terrorism, espionage, organized crime leadership, and the murder of law enforcement personnel. The physical design of ADX Florence is itself a security instrument. According to architectural and institutional descriptions published by the Federal Bureau of Prisons and documented by journalists, including Mark Curtin, whose reporting on the facility has been widely cited in academic and legal literature, the facility is constructed in a series of separated units, each designed to minimize contact between inmates and between inmates and staff. Movement within the facility is controlled through a system of remote-operated doors and barriers such that an inmate may pass through multiple security checkpoints without ever coming into direct physical proximity with another person. The standard housing unit at ADX Florence confines inmates to individual cells for approximately 22 to 24 hours per day. Each cell measures approximately 7 feet by 12 feet, though descriptions vary slightly across sources, and contains a poured concrete sleeping platform, a small desk and stool constructed from the same material, a combined stainless steel sink and toilet unit, and a small shower area within the cell itself. A narrow window, positioned near the ceiling, allows limited natural light, but is angled in such a way that the inmate cannot determine their precise geographic location from the view it provides. Television and radio access is available through controlled institutional channels as a conditional privilege, subject to behavioral compliance. The 1 hour of daily recreation permitted to standard ADX inmates takes place not in a shared yard, but in individual outdoor exercise spaces. Small concrete enclosures sometimes described in published accounts as resembling a slightly larger version of the cell itself, open to the sky, but enclosed on all sides by high concrete walls. There is no congregate recreation, no shared meal facility, no communal space of any kind in the standard housing units. Human contact with staff, with medical personnel, with legal representatives, is managed, monitored, and structurally minimized. For El Chapo, the conditions at ADX Florence represented something qualitatively unlike anything he had previously experienced within the prison system. Both Puente Grande and Altiplano, despite their maximum security classifications, had environments in which, as the evidence of his escapes demonstrated, social relationships, communication, and physical movement had remained possible. ADX Florence was specifically engineered to make all three impossible. According to reporting by the Associated Press and other credible news organizations following El Chapo's transfer, his attorneys filed legal complaints in the months after his arrival at ADX Florence, raising concerns about the conditions of his confinement. His legal team argued, among other points, that the extreme isolation conditions at ADX Florence constituted a form of punishment beyond what had been ordered by the sentencing court, and that the restrictions imposed, including severe limitations on family contact and communication, were disproportionate. These legal filings are a matter of public record and reflect a documented and ongoing legal debate about the conditions at ADX Florence that extends well beyond El Chapo's individual case. The Bureau of Prisons, for its part, has consistently maintained that the conditions at ADX Florence are lawful, operationally necessary given the profiles of the inmates housed there, and compliant with all applicable federal standards. Federal courts reviewing challenges to conditions at ADX Florence have, in the majority of cases, upheld the Bureau of Prisons' authority to impose the confinement conditions used at the facility. For the man who had twice built his way out of maximum security prisons, who had commanded an organization that moved billions of dollars and hundreds of tons of narcotics across international borders, the architecture of ADX Florence offered something that neither Puente Grande nor Altiplano had managed to provide: a world with no exits, a cell where the only direction available was inward, and outside the narrow slit of that ceiling window, 5,000 feet above sea level, in the silence of the Colorado Rockies, the world continued without him. There is a question that historians, criminologists, legal scholars, and public health researchers have wrestled with since the conclusion of El Chapo's trial in 2019. Not whether his conviction was just. The evidence presented across 3 months of federal proceedings settled that question comprehensively and beyond reasonable doubt. The question is a broader and more complicated one. What is the story of Joaquín Guzmán Loera, from a dirt-poor mountain village in Sinaloa to the most secure prison cell on the American continent, actually tell us about institutions, about poverty, about the extraordinary human cost of the drug trade on both sides of the border, and about whether removing one individual, however powerful, fundamentally changes the structural conditions that produced him. These are not political questions. They are documented, evidenced, and debated within academic literature, public health research, and law enforcement analysis. And they are questions that El Chapo's story forces into the open with unusual clarity. Let's begin with what the documented evidence tells us about the human cost of the Sinaloa cartel's operations during the period covered by El Chapo's indictment. According to testimony presented at his trial and corroborated by United States public health data, the cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine trafficked by the Sinaloa cartel during El Chapo's leadership contributed to addiction crises that affected millions of lives across the United States, Europe, and Latin America. The opioid crisis that devastated communities across the American Midwest and Northeast, documented extensively by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, was fueled in part by the heroin supply chains that organizations, including the Sinaloa cartel, maintained and expanded during precisely the years covered by El Chapo's criminal enterprise. The human geography of that crisis, the families fractured, the lives shortened, the communities hollowed out, represents consequences that no courtroom verdict can fully address or repair. At the same time, the documented evidence also tells us what happened to the Sinaloa cartel following El Chapo's permanent removal from the field. According to reporting by credible journalists, including Yohan Grillo, an analysis published by the Insight Crime Research Organization, which monitors organized crime in Latin America and is widely cited in academic and policy literature, the Sinaloa cartel did not collapse following El Chapo's extradition and conviction. It fractured. It restructured. Leadership disputes between factions aligned with El Chapo's sons, collectively known in law enforcement documentation as Los Chapitos, and those aligned with co-founder Ismael El Mayo, Zambada created internal tensions that, according to subsequent reporting, periodically erupted into violence. But the organization continued to operate. The infrastructure, the routes, the networks, the financial systems, proved more durable than any single individual within it. This is consistent with what law enforcement and academic research has documented about large criminal organizations more broadly. The removal of a leadership figure, however significant, rarely destroys the underlying structure if the economic and social conditions that sustain that structure remain unchanged. It is a finding that has been documented by the United States Government Accountability Office, cited in congressional testimony, and debated extensively within the academic criminology literature. For El Chapo himself, the years since his arrival at ADX Florence have been defined, in the public record, primarily by the legal filings of his attorneys. His defense team has continued to raise documented concerns about the conditions of his confinement, the extreme isolation, the restrictions on family contact, the sensory limitations of the ADX environment. These filings are a matter of public court record and reflect genuine legal debates about the outer boundaries of permissible confinement conditions within the United States federal system. Independent human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and the American Civil Liberties Union, have, in separate contexts, raised concerns about solitary confinement practices at ADX Florence that apply to the inmate population as a whole, not specifically to El Chapo, and these concerns have been the subject of ongoing litigation and congressional debate. What the public record does not contain, and what ADX Florence is specifically designed to prevent, is any meaningful account of El Chapo's daily existence from El Chapo himself. He communicates with his legal team under monitored and restricted conditions. His family contact is severely limited. He gives no interviews. He makes no public statements. The man who was once the subject of a global media phenomenon, whose escapes generated international headlines, whose trial was covered by hundreds of accredited journalists, now exists, for the purposes of the public record, almost entirely in the third person, described by others, documented in legal filings. Physically present in a cell in Colorado, but functionally absent from the world, he once moved through so consequentially. His wife, Emma Coronel Ice Bureau, was herself arrested by United States federal authorities in February 2021 and subsequently pleaded guilty to charges related to drug trafficking conspiracy and assisting in El Chapo's 2015 escape from Altiplano, charges documented in federal court filings in the District of Columbia. She was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and released in 2023, according to Bureau of Prisons records. The legal consequences of El Chapo's world extended, as they so often do in cases of the scale, far beyond the principal defendant. His sons, Joaquín Guzmán López and Ovidio Guzmán López, known collectively as Los Chapitos, have themselves become subject to United States federal indictments. Ovidio Guzmán López was extradited to the United States in 2023, according to reporting by the Associated Press, and confirmed by the Department of Justice. The legal pursuit of El Chapo's organization has continued well beyond his own imprisonment, reflecting the scale and complexity of what was built during his years of operation. And in La Tuna, the small mountain village in Sinaloa, where Joaquín Guzmán Loera was born in 1957, life continues largely as it has for generations. The Sierra Madre mountains remain. The isolation remains. The economic conditions that shaped the choices available to a child born there more than 6 decades ago have not been transformed by the verdict delivered in a Brooklyn federal courtroom. That is not a political observation. It is simply what the documented evidence shows. The story of El Chapo is, in the end, several stories simultaneously. It is the story of a criminal organization of extraordinary reach and destructive consequence. It is the story of a decades-long law enforcement pursuit across 2 nations and multiple jurisdictions. It is the story of a legal proceeding that tested and ultimately confirmed the capacity of the United States federal justice system to hold even the most powerful criminal defendants accountable. And it is the story of what accountability looks like when it arrives, not as a dramatic moment of redemption or transformation, but as a concrete cell in the Colorado Rockies, and a door that does not open. El Chapo is currently serving his sentence at ADX Florence. He will, barring any successful future legal challenge, remain there for the rest of his natural life. The mountains of Sinaloa are over 1,500 miles away. He will not see them again. The story of Joaquín Guzmán Loera, El Chapo, is one of the most extensively documented criminal cases of the 21st century. It is a story told not in rumor or legend, but in court transcripts, DEA reports, federal indictments, and the verified testimony of more than 50 witnesses. Behind the walls of ADX Florence, one chapter has definitively closed, but the broader story of the organizations he helped build, the communities affected by their operations, and the ongoing legal reckoning with his legacy continues to be written. This has been Behind the Wall Stories. You just watched the full documented story of El Chapo, from the mountains of Sinaloa to the most secure prison cell on the American continent. Every fact you heard in this documentary is verified, sourced, and real. If this story made you think, if it held your attention from the first second to this one, then this channel was built for you. Hit that subscribe button right now and join Behind the Wall Stories community, because we go inside the prisons, the cases, and the stories that the world needs to understand, not for shock value, for truth. Drop a comment below. We want to know, does security at ADX Florence surprise you? Do you think El Chapo will ever successfully challenge his conditions of confinement in court? Tell us what you think. Share this documentary with someone who loves true crime, real history, and stories that actually matter. Behind the Wall Stories. Real prisons. Real cases. Real truth. Subscribe. Comment. Share.